Yes.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. Um, so, Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge some of my colleagues. Dr. Alan Franklin is the PI for our project in Northwest California, and he is with the National Wildlife Research Center in Colorado. Mark Higley is biologist at the Hoopa Valley Reservation. Jeremy Rockwhite and Angela Rex are also with Colorado State University, been instrumental in doing our field research. And Keith Hom is with Green Diamond Resource Company, who also shared some data. I'd like to thank all of them for support. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Rocky Gutierrez, who used to be at Humboldt State University. He was the PI for our project for many years, as well as several other demographic studies on the spotted owl. So I'll go over a little bit of what the talk is going to include this evening. First, I'll give some background information on the spotted owl demographic studies, talk a little bit about the Bardot Invasion, look at some of the impacts barred owls have on spotted owls, and then we'll get into some details on long-term trends of the owl populations, an update on some of the barred owl removal studies, and then look at some of the additional threats that the spotted owls are facing. So there are 3 long-term spotted owl demographic studies in Humboldt County. In 1985, Alan Franklin started our study on the Willow Creek study area. That study area is outlined in blue. And that study has since expanded to other areas in the region, which I'll get into later. In 1990, Green Diamond Resource Company initiated a study under Lowell Diller. Their lands are outlined in yellow. And in 1992, a study was started on the Hoopa Valley Reservation under Mark Higley. Then on all 3 of these studies, barred owl specific monitoring began in 2009. Prior to that, we did record barred owls detected, but those were all ancillary to spotted owl specific surveys. Also in 2009, Green Diamond began a pilot study on barred owl removal, which lasted for 5 years. Actually 6 years, I guess. And then in 2013, on Hoopa, they began barred owl removal as part of the larger barred owl removal experiment that Fish and Wildlife Service has organized. For that, Willow Creek study area is acting as a control. Also mention that all 3 of these studies have been part of meta-analyses of the trends every 5 years. And then our study, the Northwest California study, is part of long-term monitoring set up under the Northwest Forest Plan. A primary goal of the demographic studies is to track marked individuals each year. And for owls that we locate, we determine their sex, pair status, reproductive status, and age. I would like to point out that spotted owls don't necessarily nest most years. Long-term average is about 50% of pairs will nest in a given year. And then we take that information and we use mark recapture methods to estimate traits such as survival, recruitment, and population change. As I mentioned, owls that we, a lot of the owls we have in the population are already banded, and ones that we locate, we try to identify them by color band top left, you can see part of the light blue and orange band. Owls that are not banded, we capture and band with both a numbered metal band as well as a color band. And field crews go in to locate owls and record information such as the identity of the owls, as well as if they're nesting, and if so, how many fledge are found. On the bottom right photo is an example of some typical habitat that we find the owls in interior forests that are predominantly dug fir with hardwood understory. The picture on the left is kind of an overview of part of our study area. Gives you an idea of some of the habitat type and the type of terrain that we work in. It's the Trinity Alps in the background. And on the excuse me, on the right shows another close-up shot of the typical type of habitat that we often find the owls roosting in the interior forest. Here, Angela is trying to see the band on an owl. So historically, barred owls were confined to the eastern U.S., did not occur west of the Great Plains. But they have shown a fairly rapid invasion of the Pacific Northwest over the last 60 years or so. This is a set of maps from a publication by Long and Wolf. And each map shows barred owl detections starting in 1910 in the Western US, and then goes up through a more recent decade. So from this, you can see that in Washington, barred owls started being detected in the 1960s. Before that, they were up in British Columbia. And then 1970s, started seeing them in Northern Oregon. And actually there was a couple likely detections in Northern California in the 70s, but really didn't start getting detections in Northern California until the 80s. And by 2000, barred owls were detected throughout the range of the northern spotted owl. And there were a few detections in the northern Sierra Nevada. And then in more recent years, barred owls have been detected all the way down into the southern Sierra Nevada and are starting to impact the California spotted owls. It is hypothesized that the barred owls were able to move west of the Great Plains with an increase in forested areas due to impacts of European settlement, which included fire suppression, as well as planting of trees along riparian areas. In Northern California, as I mentioned, the detections were fairly low prior to 1990 or 2000. This is a map from California Fish and Wildlife from their CND database. Each dot represents basically a simple detection. It could be a single barred owl or a pair. Detections prior to 1990 are shown in orange, and there's only a handful of those. Detections 1990 through 2000 are shown in green, and then detections since 2000 are shown in blue. You will see some clustering, especially in Humboldt County, and also a little bit in Mendocino County. Those are largely due to the spider owl surveys on either demographic studies or some large timber company holdings. So the barred owls can have various impacts on a spotted owl, which can include reduced vocal response to surveys. That can make it more difficult to determine if a specific area is occupied by spotted owls. There can be interference competition, with the barred owl typically being a dominant species. There can also be competition for resources, such as prey, the prey base, or nesting and roosting habitat. And there has been hybridization, although it's typically been observed to be fairly low levels and not considered to be an issue. However, as spotted owl populations go down, there could be more opportunity for hybridization, and I'll discuss that a little bit more. Nick Van Lannen did a playback experiment to address the idea of interference competition. And that he used models based on taxidermic models along with a playback setup, and he would set up within a known owl site, and he would use a barred owl model and barred owl calls in a spotted owl site, or he would use a spotted owl model with spotted owl calls in a barred owl site, and record any kind of reaction that the resident owls would have. And basically what he found is that barred owls responded with higher levels of vocal and physical aggression to the spotted owl calls than spotted owls did to the barred owl calls. David Weens did a large study looking at competition between the two species in Oregon. And this is an excerpt from some of his work looking at spatial overlap of 2 spotted owl pairs and 5 barred owl pairs that had been radio marked on this study. And on these maps, the seasonal home range is indicated by the larger polygons, and a core use area indicated by that smaller polygon, with the barred owls being open lines and the spotted owls with shaded polygons. And then an activity center indicated by a black dot for the spotted owls and a black triangle for the barred owls. So you can see, definite overlap of the home range. And then I'd like to point out the green circle indicating the activity center for the Wolf Creek spotted owl pair in 2007, which they had to shift in 2008. They shifted their activity center outside of their previous home range because a pair of barred owls took over that previous home range. So certainly competition for space and habitat indicated here. Another aspect that David Weens looked at, and several other studies have also looked at diet overlap between the two species. Here I summarize some of Weens' findings in the broad categories. So you can see small mammals are a large part of the diet for both spotted and barred owls, and there's a fair amount of overlap. Some of you probably know that spotted owls specialize on a few small mammals, especially wood rats, dusky-footed wood rats in this area, and Humboldt's flying squirrel. Whereas the barred owl is more of a prey generalist and takes a wider variety of items. And you can see here things such as crayfish and snails that you don't think of as, and salamanders. You don't think of as a typical owl diet. And then, as I mentioned, hybridization has typically been pretty uncommon. But as the numbers of spotted owls decline, they may have, an individual spotted owl may have less opportunity to locate a mate and may opt to mate with a barred owl with their numbers being higher. On this photo, you can see a fairly typical coloration of a hybrid owl, especially on the breast, which has some of both the vertical barring that you would see in a barred owl, as well as the horizontal patterns typical in a spotted owl. Another feature is the facial disc is, the coloration is in between. Spotted owls tend to be darker coloration than seen here, and barred owls tend to be lighter in coloration of the facial disc. The owl pictured here was located last summer by a Forest Service crew. They noted that he was banded and contacted me to see if we might have any information on that. So we went back and we were able to recapture and confirm that it was a hybrid male that I had first captured 5 years ago, just outside of Hoopa Reservation. Here, the photo on the left is the hybrid in his juvenile year. You can see a blue cohort band on his right leg. And then the center picture is the same individual as an adult last summer. And you can see that the coloration has, he retained the same pattern of coloration. And last summer, also found out that the hybrid male was mated with a barred owl female, and they had 3 offspring. And one of them is pictured on the right. The second generation hybrids are usually very difficult to tell by the plumage, and I suspect also probably by their vocalizations. They tend to look much more like the dominant species. All right. As I mentioned earlier, the Northwest California study includes the Willow Creek study area, which was initiated in 1985, and what we call the regional study area, which was started 2 years later. And that consists, that consists of clusters of 2 to 5 owl territories throughout the region. On this map, the Willow Creek study area is outlined in the center, and then the other small polygons indicate some of the owl territories scattered throughout the region. Most of our sites are located in Forest Service land, and that includes 6 Rivers, Shasta Trinity, and Klamath National Forests. And we also have a few sites on BLM property, such as Larrabee Buttes. So getting into the heart of the story, you can look at some long-term trends. In this chart, the blue lines indicate the spotted owl population based on our demographic modeling. And you can see from the early 1990s through about 2006 or 7, a general decline, but not very rapid. But then following 2008, a fairly rapid decline to recent years. This coincided with an increase in Bardot detections. The dashed red line indicates the number of spotted owl sites we have with Bardot detections each year. You can see a rapid increase after 2008. Excuse me. The solid red line indicates an estimated number of Bardot sites, which we just estimate based on the clustering of detections we get. We do not typically follow up on the Bardots to confirm pair status or nesting status. Although, occasionally we get that information, but we don't typically do that. A pair of Bardots can also be detected in more than one spotted owl site, and therefore have an impact on more than one pair of spotted owls. Another method that is being used a little more often now to help monitor the owls is autonomous recording units, which we placed out in the habitat and left for sometimes weeks at a time. We have collaborated a little bit with Mark Higley at Hoopa to use some of these ARUs at nest sites. They started doing that on Hoopa in 2016, and then the following year we started placing some at a few of our nest sites on the Willow Creek study area. So this chart shows the number of nesting sites each year that we monitored with ARUs. The center column is the number of those sites with Bardot detections. So each year, at least half of the nesting sites had Bardots detected nearby. And the right-hand column is the number of sites where those Bardots were only detected with ARUs and not detected with our normal spotted owl surveys. And that was always, or typically more than half the time, we only picked them up with the ARUs. We wouldn't have been aware of Bardots visiting a nest area without those. And sometimes the Bardots might be visiting multiple times. For example, at one of our spotted owl sites called Schoolhouse Creek, ARU set up there detected 4 different dates with interactions between the spotted and Bardot over a 9-day period. And fairly regularly, we'll hear both species picked up on the ARUs. And see if I can play an example of one of those. Should first hear a female doing what we refer to as crow barks, followed by the Bardot female. At the end there, you're hearing the female do some agitated calls, and that went on for at least another minute on the recording with both the female and male both of the spotted owl pair sounding quite agitated. The Bardot Invasion was aptly called a conservation conundrum by Rocket Gutierrez back in 2007, when it became apparent that Bardots were increasing in population and likely impacting northern spotted owls throughout their range. It was proposed that only through experiments removing barred owls could we determine if they were a cause of the spotted owl decline, or if they were simply taking advantage of spotted owl populations declining for some other factors. So the Fish and Wildlife Service carefully set up a study to examine the impact of the barred owl. And I say carefully in part because they did spend 3 years developing an environmental impact statement. And for that, they hired an ethicist and invited all interested parties, including the National Audubon Society, to participate in discussions on how such an experiment should be set up and run. So the study design includes treatment areas where barred owls are removed and control areas where the barred owls are only monitored. There are 4 study areas under the Fish and Wildlife Service study. 1 in Oregon, 1 in Washington, 2 in Oregon, and then 1 in California, which is the Hoopa study area where barred owls are being removed, and the Willow Creek study area where we act as a control. And then it was decided for analyzing results from the experiment, they would include the pilot study that Green Diamond did in 2009 to 2014. In all cases, barred owls were initially removed during non-nesting season, but when surveys indicated that new recruits were not nesting, then the protocol indicated that removals could occur throughout the year. That was to avoid leaving any young abandoned. For each study area, removals occurred for 5 to 7 years to allow for modeling effects on spotted owl occupancy, survival, reproduction, and population change. So looking at some information from Hoopa, on the graph indicates the number of barred owls with males shown in blue and females in orange that were removed each year. And it's been fairly consistent, the number of barred owls removed each year. After 2015, almost all of the barred owls have been subadults, indicating that they are coming into the study area, taking advantage of vacancies from the previous barred owl removals. So they're indication that there's plenty of barred owls on the landscape to come fill in. To maximize information obtained from the barred owls, samples from each specimen are taken for a variety of research goals. These include looking at genetics, looking at diet, rodenticide exposure, and most of the specimens are donated to museums such as the California Academy of Sciences. Looking at the long-term trends of owls on the Hoopa reservation, red line indicates the proportion of territories that are occupied by a pair of spotted owls. It was a fairly slow decline until around 2005 or so, when the decline of spotted owls increased, and again correlates well with increase in the number of Bardot detections. With initiation of Bardot removal in the fall of 2013, detections of Bardots did drop quite a bit, but there are still plenty of detections occurring each year. And you can see with the red line that in recent years, the spotted owl population on Hoopa has gone back up a little bit. And I believe in 2020, it went up a little bit more. Comparing the numbers of Bardots removed on the Hoopa study area compared to green diamond over the same, during a similar time period, on Hoopa, they removed 4 times as many Bardots on an area that's smaller than, I believe is smaller than the green diamond removal study, which is an indication of an increase in the Bardot population. Also, last fall, green diamond was able to, they did reinitiate removing Bardots, and they did so at 19 sites where they removed 45 Bardots from those 19 sites, which compares pretty well with the number of Bardots removed on Hoopa last year at 29 sites. So both sets of numbers strongly indicate a much larger Bardot population now than there was 5 to 10 years ago. So I'd like to get into some additional threats that we see to spotted owls. One is rodenticide exposure. Gabriel et al. In 2018 reported on a study where they tested the Bardots that were collected on green diamond during their initial Bardot removal period, and about 40% of those had been exposed to rodenticide. Additionally, they were able to test 10 spotted owls that were opportunistically collected. Those were specimens such as roadkills or similar, and 7 of those tested positive for rodenticide. And more recently on Hoopa, this is information from Mark Higley showing the proportion of Bardots that they removed, separated out by sex and age class. But overall, about 2/3 of those Bardots had been exposed to rodenticide. I'll point out that the levels of rodenticide certainly do not indicate a cause of mortality. In fact, a lot of cases, weren't anywhere near the level you would expect to cause mortality. However, it is completely unknown what kind of effect lower doses of rodenticide might have. They could lead to problems with being more exposed to predation or disease, something like that. An interesting case study is a adult female spotted owl that one of our field crews found in 2017 within their core use area. It is incredibly rare to find a freshly deceased adult owl. This is the only case so far on our study. And the map on the right, the red star indicates where the female had been found. And she was likely dead for less than 12 hours based on the condition of the body. The black dots indicate daytime locations for that territory, The blue dots are nighttime locations. The red polygons indicate marijuana grow operations. Most of those are on private lands, the hashed areas. But the red triangle indicates a previously illegal trespass grow on Forest Service land. And then we assume that exposure in the owls is through the prey items they get. And wood rats may be attracted to the grow operations. An additional threat to spotted owls is severe wildfire. We looked at the effects of different wildfires on our owl population. That study was headed up by Jeremy Rockwhite. And the map shown here indicates fire severity with low severity in light blue, moderate severity in yellow, and high burn severity in red. And the green is unburned. In those situations, generally the habitat quality is not impacted, and in fact, in some cases may be improved. And we saw no change in survival recruitment to the population. The photo here is an example on one of our sites. And you can see that the understory was burned, but the canopy was intact. You could see a bit of that in the background. And owls continue to use this. There is an owl in this photo, indicated by the red circle. And if I recall correctly, this fire was in 2008. And we continue to see owls using this area. In fact, they nested near this spot last summer. With higher levels of moderate and high severity burn, habitat quality is reduced some, and we end up seeing a lot more turnover in the owls. So reduced survival, but an increase in the recruitment. And then where fire severity is mostly high, it's indicated by all the red in that right-hand diagram. We see a loss of nesting and roosting habitat, and we see much higher reduction in survival. This is a photo that Mark Higley took near one of our owl sites up by the red salmon fire last fall. And a good example of the ground cover being totally gone, as well as a mid-story, and that canopy showing some kill. So definitely a reduction in habitat. As we all know, the 2020 fire season was unprecedented in its extent. However, the impact on owl habitat is uncertain at this point. However, soil burn severity maps are available. This is one for the red salmon fire east of Hoopa. And as expected, there's a lot of mixed fire, although there are some large patches of moderate and high severity fire. We zoom in on that western area. There are 2 owl sites that we monitor long-term, indicated by the blue circles. You can see those areas were an area where the fire was more low severity with a little bit of moderate severity. So we expect to be able to see owls continuing to use those locations. And none of these impacts on the owls happen completely independently. There can be synergistic effects, so that with an increased Bardot population, effects from other stressors could be enhanced. For example, an increased pressure on the prey base by barred owls may lead to spotted owls foraging farther and thus having increased exposure to rodenticides. Also, an increase in fire severity can result in the loss of high quality habitat, which barred owls may then preferentially occupy and outcompete the spotted owls. And higher reproduction by barred owls, which are diet generalists, can result in increased pressure on the spotted owls. Finally, I would like to point out that when it comes to looking at the impact of barred owls, it's not all about the spotted owls. Barred owls can certainly have a large impact on other species and the forest ecosystem as a whole. For instance, mycorrhizal fungi depend on small mammals to be spread throughout the forest ecosystem, especially flying squirrels. And without a good amount of mycorrhizal fungi, the forest ecosystem can suffer a bit. And in looking for a nice summary of species that barred owls can take for their diet, I happened to find this summary on Audubon website, which I thought was a nice quick summary. It shows a wide range of species that they'll take, including things as crayfish and crabs and salamanders that you just typically won't think of owls including in their diet. And especially in the Pacific Northwest, there's a number of salamander species that are of concern or even listed. And there is some study up in Oregon looking at the potential impact of barred owls on salamanders. So while I would like to end this talk on a high note, when it comes to discussing trends in spotted owls, there is no high note. Barred owls clearly are having an impact on spotted owls through competition for resources and aggressive behavior, which can result in spotted owls using more marginal areas. But there are other stressors on the spotted owls, including increased fire severity, which is expected to just get worse with climate change. In the past, I'd say in the past 5 years or so, there seems to be increased use of rodenticide in forested areas and increased exposure to the owls. And finally, I'll end with barred owls are certainly an immediate threat that needs to be addressed to allow spotted owl populations to continue in the foreseeable future. So with that, I'd be happy to address any questions. Uh-oh.
Well, thanks, Peter. I don't have any questions in chat right off. If anyone has a question for Peter Carlson, go ahead and type it into the chat window and I'll pick it up. There's one right off the bat. This is a question that you probably can answer pretty readily. What impact does logging have on the barred owl populations?
On the barred owl, well, in general, barred owls use very similar areas for nesting and roosting as spotted owls. They will use a more wide range of habitat. But at least on our study, we often find the barred owls in the same areas that we had previously found spotted owls. I mean, it hasn't been looked at as, as specifically, but logging probably has similar type of effects on barred owls as it does on spotted owls.
Meaning that logging impairs the habitat for barred owls.
Yeah, in general, logging would be a loss of habitat for barred owls.
Interesting. Is that a short-term effect? Because it seems like the barred owls can respond pretty quickly to cut over areas.
That's a good point, and they should be able to respond quicker, in part because they are a prey generalist, so they can easily switch prey. They also usually have more young each year, so their population could rebound much quicker, as long as there's appropriate habitat.
How dependent are the barred owls on old growth or canopy cover? The spotted owls seem to really need that for temperature regulation and protection. Do the barred owls have a little more flexibility?
I would say they certainly have more flexibility. I don't know if has been, well, there have been some telemetry studies done in Oregon with both species radioed, looking at, and they typically find some overlap in the home range. Barred owls certainly using some of the same habitat type, the mature forest. I think they as far as we know, they don't have the same temperature limitation that the spotted owl does. So they probably don't need quite the canopy closure that spotted owls usually have in this region.
So the barred is able to tolerate more temperature range.
Yeah, as far as we know, but I don't think that's been specifically looked at.
Okay. Well, we got a couple more questions. They're rolling in now. Thanks. Here's a good one. I think one you just answered. Is the barred owl habitat broader than the spotted owl? I think the answer to that's yes. They're able to use a wider variety of habitat. But are there barred owl predators? Is there anything that preys on the barred owl?
Well, great horned owls would be a predator. Probably some mammals, such as a fisher, if they can access a nest to get at the young barred owls. So there are some predators.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. The great horned owl, kind of maybe around the margins of the habitat. Do great horned owls really? How much does their habitat type overlap with the barred and spotted?
Yeah, it would just be kind of at the margins. So I really have no idea how. I don't expect that they're I wouldn't call them a common predator. Similar to the spotted owls, great horned owls will predate spotted owls, but it's not that common just because they're be in the periphery of where the owls would be located.
Yeah. The question is, what limits the barred owl in the eastern forests? I guess that means what environmental constraints do they have on proliferating there?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't know. It's possible they're predators in the east that are more used to dealing with barred owls. 50 years ago, barred owls were very uncommon here, and so for a predator to learn how to deal with a new species in the area. But yeah, I'm really not sure what limits them in the east. It's also possible. It's also possible that it's something with the prey base in the west versus what they have available in the east.
Yeah, my understanding from Dr. Dumbacher was they're more or less the apex avian predator in the eastern hardwood forest.
That would make sense, yeah.
Yeah, there's not much that limits them. They're self-limited by how much territory they can make use of, and they pretty much get the hardwood forest. And what kept them there was the absence of a way to move further west. And I thought it was interesting looking at those maps you showed that they really kind of seem to indicate the barred owl moved across the northern plains and
yes.
not across the U.S., but maybe along the margin of the boreal forest in Canada. Because I've read that there's an alternative hypothesis that migration was facilitated as much by climate change, which changed the amount of snow-free area that was available for the owls in the southern limit of the boreal forest. And those dots clustering up along the northern edge of their range would seem to go along with that.
Yeah, I've always been surprised at how far north they've been found. But again, those are just individuals, most likely. They probably didn't stick around very long, I would guess. Yeah. But it is surprising how far north they've been found.
As you know, they're hard to miss.
Yeah.
And there's an awful lot of birders in the U.S., and it's hard for me to believe that barred owl could have sneaked across the central U.S. without being detected. So I think those locations are probably pretty reliable. So here's a question I think was answered early on, but maybe a lot of people joined the talk as you were going along. Are you getting less vocalization from barred owls when doing spotted owl calls as the barred owls have become more saturated? So as the habitat gets filled up with barred owls, are they responding less to spotted owl calls, or do they still investigate?
Well, what I can say is both species will respond to the other species' calls, but at a lower level than they would to their own calls.
Yeah, okay.
Along with that, what we have observed with our survey effort is it appears that once a pair of barred owls has been established for a little while, they get used to the surveys and respond less. That is speculation because we don't know for sure it's the same barred owls there year after year, but it makes sense. I mean, we have banded a few barred owls, and in a couple cases we have identified the same barred owl in a territory for say like 8 years in a row, or at least over an 8-year time span. So we know a pair of barred owls can stay in the same territory for a long term, and why their response rate would go down, don't know for sure, but there has been work indicating that spotted owls will respond less to neighboring calls because they don't feel they need to respond to a neighbor, but they will respond more readily to a stranger call.
So within their territories, they've got a high degree of fidelity to a territory. Do they reuse the same nest year after year? What's their nest fidelity like?
We see a wide range. I mean, we do have cases with a single nest tree being used several times. But more often we'll see a pair use different nest trees over time. We have some territories that over say a 25-year period, we document 8 different nest trees.
Interesting.
So we see both examples.
Here's a good one. How do you remove the barred owls, and where do they get taken to?
So it is lethal removal of the barred owls with specialized shotguns. When Fish and Wildlife Service did their AIS, they did look at different alternatives for removing barred owls. And part of that was they contacted places throughout the US to see who might be willing to take a barred owl if they were captured live. And they contacted, as far as I know, hundreds of places. And they only were able to find, they only got responses for maybe, kind of making up a number, but like 10 barred owls. So there's no way it was going to be efficient to try to capture live barred owls. They've done that once or twice for somewhere that did want a live barred owl, but pretty much all of them are lethal removals. And then I think I mentioned almost all the specimens end up going to a museum. A lot of them are gone to California Academy of Sciences, some to UC Berkeley, some to the Natural History Museum in Chicago. So they're at least they're getting used for additional research that way.
Yeah, Dr. Dumbacher curates the ornithology collection at California Academy of Sciences. So this provided him with a lot of specimens to work with, and he does a lot of genetic testing on those things. So got some more questions to get through. This is an interesting one relating to, this is, to me, this is a living example happening in front of our eyes of rapid evolutionary change. And so we don't really know how components of the ecosystem are going to adapt. So this question is kind of part of that. Are you seeing any expansion of prey base in spotted owls due to the barred owl presence and pressure? So are you seeing any evidence that spotted owls are adapting to that by making use of more kinds of prey?
It's not something that we've looked at specifically. We do continue to collect owl pellets, for potential diet analysis, but that's not something that's looked at on a regular basis. So can't really answer that specifically, but my guess is no, they are not. If they were able to, we probably wouldn't see as drastic a reduction in survival rates. And we are seeing a big reduction in survival rates.
Yeah, and it's probably a little soon for a lot of that kind of adaptation to be showing up. I mean, this is all really quite recent, evolutionarily speaking anyway. To what extent have barred owls replaced arboreal mammalian predators like fishers and martens that are disappearing?
That's another very good question.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. I know, talking with Mark Higley, the biologist at Hoopa, he thinks there could easily be competition between the barred owl and fishers and possibly martens as well. How much impact that is, I certainly have no idea. Barred owls are likely increasing the pressure on the prey that fishers and martens use as well.
Yeah, a new competitor. That would appear to be all the questions that we have in front of me here. I don't see any more questions. Anyone else have anything you want to type in chat right quick? Otherwise, we are